Welcome to Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs, presented by SpeechTherapyPD.com. This podcast is designed for the adult medical speech-language pathologist. Most of our audience members work in settings such as acute care hospitals, private practice, outpatient hospital clinics, and inpatient rehabilitation hospitals. Each episode has an accompanying audio course on SpeechTherapyPD.com and is available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. The content of this course is based on the research and experience of the presenters. The listener is responsible for researching to determine if the information and skills taught are appropriate for their clients, students, or patients. SpeechTherapyPD.com does not necessarily endorse, recommend, or favor the information shared, nor any of the claims, opinions, statements, offers, or services made by the presenter.
Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Renee Garrett and I'm your Speech Therapy PD podcast host for Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs. Before we get started, we have a few items to alert you to. Each episode is 60 minutes and will be offered for 0.1 ASHA CEU. Here are the financial and non-financial disclosures. Sucheta Kamath is the founder and owner of a private practice. She's a CEO of EXQ software curriculum and benefits from its sales. Ms. Kamath received compensation for this presentation from Speech Therapy PD. She has no relevant non-financial relationships to disclose. My financial disclosure is that I'm a paid employee of a private consulting firm in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and as the host of Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs, and other webinars on Speech Therapy PD, I do receive financial compensation. I'm also an adjunct faculty instructor at both James Madison University and Old Dominion University. My non-financial disclosure is that I am the secretary for the Communication Disorders Foundation of Virginia. Questions can be written in the chat box or the Q&A and will be answered if relevant throughout the presentation. Now, without further ado, we welcome our guest, Sucheta Kamath, MA, CCC-SLP, BC ANDS, who is an award-winning speech-language pathologist, a TEDx speaker, and a tech entrepreneur who has created EXQ, a cloud-based 100% digital personalized curriculum for middle and high school students designed to assess and build executive function competency through games, error analysis, and metacognitive lessons. She's also the host of a podcast, Full Prefrontal, Exposing the Mysteries of Executive Function, where her invited guests range from neuroscientists, research psychologists, educators, learning specialists, journalists, and thought leaders. In addition to being Georgia's 2024 and 25 Education Policy Fellow, a program that's part of the Institute for Educational Leadership, or IEL, Sucheta serves on many nonprofit boards, including the ASH Foundation, the Leadership Atlanta, and the National Multi-Faith Initiative to End Mass Incarceration, or EMI, as well as the Georgia Speech Language Hearing Foundation, which she co-founded in 2016. Lastly, Sucheta has been instrumental in creating and leading a cost-free GISHA Gives Leadership Through Communication, which is a free communication and executive function job readiness training program for Atlanta's work-ready, previously incarcerated, and displaced community. Sucheta, so great to see you, and thank you for being with us.
So fantastic to see you in our non-glamorous clothes. Last met at ASH Foundation Gala.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I'm wearing my All Brains Are Beautiful because, brainstorms and executive functions, and my sweet friends, Serena and Kylie, who run a company called PlaySpark that was hard hit by the hurricane in Asheville, North Carolina. So I try to wear my shirts to support them when I can. But yes, so thank you so much for being here with us. I know it's tough this time of year to get motivated or is that just me to get motivated? We're kind of wrapping up an end of the year, but advocacy to me is something that's so important, and you've done such a great job in so many different areas of not only promoting advocacy, but, thinking outside the box, which I really love that about you. So I'd like to start by just having you describe kind of what advocacy is and some ways that we as communication science disorders professionals can advocate, because we're not just speech language pathologists, we're SLPAs, we're audiologists, and we have a lot of multidisciplinary teammates that we can help kind of set the stage for them being a part of advocacy as well.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm so honored to be with you. And also, I really appreciate you picking this topic because you and I both share brain injuries, executive function, neurological disorders, neurocommunication disorders. And we often leave advocacy as outside the scope of practice, or it's something you banter over, tea or cocktails. So I really like that we're starting off with advocacy and giving PD for clinicians, researchers for addressing this very important topic. So fundamentally, advocacy involves educating, informing, or persuading others to support, champion, and promote the interest or cause of a person or a group, particularly the need of a person or a group that is underrepresented or itself is not able to stand and advocate for themselves. So a couple of ingredients that go into advocacy, in my opinion, is number one is a strong emotional response to unfairness or injustice, a burning desire for change, inner unrest for status quo, strong executive function, which allows you to reprioritize for greater good, and relentless goal-directed persistence, which is also strong executive function. So I hope that kind of sets the stage of what we are talking about when we talk about advocacy. And if I may continue a little bit, there are kind of three types of advocacies. And it was interesting, ASHA 2024 convention, and if those who have access or maybe saw this poster, Ariane Bird and Nicole Rea had a poster on advocacy, and they also talked about three types of advocacies, which is something all my life's work is around these three types of advocacies. But so the first, I think, can be a self-advocacy. That means I am standing up for myself. I am speaking on behalf of me and removing any barriers in understanding. The second one is individual advocacy. And the individual is when a person or a group of people concentrate their effort together to improve outcome of one or few individuals. So it's like, I was at International IDEA conference in Dallas in October, and I was giving a talk, and they honored the woman in New Jersey, a mother who got the award for public service for dyslexia code, decoding dyslexia. She founded Decoding Dyslexia. So that's an individual advocacy where she started with her own son, and she advocated, championed in her child's school, and then it caught like a fire. But the last advocacy is really about system advocacy. And so this typically comes to most people's mind when we talk about advocacy. For example, ASHA's advocacy or ASHA PAC, or when we talk about ASH Foundation and its impactful work in supporting people who are doing the work in the field. So I hope that makes kind of for starters a framework of how to think about advocacy.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. I think a lot of people get overwhelmed when they hear that word. It sounds a little intimidating and scary. And so one of the things that I often will lead in with is those micro parts, right? Those little micro things that people do that they don't think, like, I'm sure this lady that you mentioned in New Jersey, she's advocating for her son. She's advocating for something that, we all hope that will become a greater cause, but we don't know that. And it starts out typically with an idea, or just you being someone who says, hey, I'm going to go to my state conference and I want to be more involved, but I don't really know what to do. How about I just stand around where events are happening, whether it's the opening ceremonies or the keynote speaker or the student posters, and you can say, hey, yeah, the student posters are down the hall on the left. Thanks for being here. That's a micro volunteerism effort. And anybody can do that. It doesn't take much time. It doesn't take any prep. And I think when we think about advocacy, often starts in those little micro efforts that can lead to bigger projects.
Yeah, and I think I had on my podcast, I had a researcher who studies anger as an emotion. And because I'm very interested in emotional resilience and executive function, and anger is one of the reasons that stops you from achieving goals. But actually, it's very interesting. At the heart of advocacy is anger. So if you channel your anger, that means if you witnessed injustice or you have experienced injustice, you can actually channel that anger so that other people will not experience the same injustice. So there is something called enlightened self-interest goals. That means I have a goal that is a little bit selfish or and I'll give you my example. It's a hilarious story, but it was not even anger. But I moved to Georgia and I went to GASHA conference, Georgia Speech and Hearing Association annual convention. And I was a little bit peeved that they did not center enough conversations around neurogenic communication disorders and brain injuries. So of course, I marched to the president, and it was Kelly Ball. And I always tell Kelly is the beginning of my end, which is my free time went away because of Kelly. But I loved, so I went to her and I complained. So that was my little anger or irritation, that why are you not programming, or why do you not have experts who can talk about blah, blah, blah? She did one thing. She said to me, would you like to join? And boom, I was trapped. I was like, so I think I never thought that I was looking at the world and say, you need to fix. Renee, you need to do a better programming. You, Kelly, need to do better. And I wasn't even equating me in the equation. So that was kind of such a radical step that happened in my journey as I joined the GASHA board then immediately. So anyway, so I think pay attention to small things that are causing you inconvenience, and take a look and ask yourself, is this a systemic issue or is this my mismanagement? And if it is not your mismanagement, then that's the place to advocate. So many people can benefit.
Yeah, I laugh a little because my journey onto the board was not, I always say it wasn't my fault, but it was a mentor of mine who saw something in me. And my response to the question of, hey, we have our secretary is going back to get her PhD. Would you be interested in becoming the secretary? And I was like, why not? But then I was also like, oh gosh, this is very overwhelming, because at that point I was very early on in my career. And I thought, oh gosh, I'm not this really, am I worthy to do this? And that's a lot of times that self-deprecating thing, you're like, oh, I don't know if I'm qualified. Here I'm, master's degree and working on my certified brain injury specialty at the time. And I'm thinking, oh gosh, these people are so much more well prepared, and business people that are in high up leadership positions in their job, not just in the state leadership organization. So that was my end. Was someone asked me and I said, why not? And that's often what we do. It's like, why shouldn't I, or why wouldn't I? Because I thought, oh, this could be a really great experience.
Yes.
And it has been. 8 years later, in 2020, I was the president. And I joke a lot, and people know that I can be very sarcastic. And I say, of all the things that you want to be in 2020, it's the president of nothing. You don't want to be. It happened the way it happened, but I will say I learned a lot of lessons that I probably would not have learned otherwise. I had to grow a lot as a leader to do everything from crafting statements about social injustice and things that were going on against the advice of some of the team that was helping manage our organization. And again, I said, why not? Why wouldn't I? Why wouldn't we as an organization want to stand up and say, this is not okay, and we will not support this social injustice in ways that you could be involved? And it was hard, but it was a learning experience. And so I think sometimes the why not gets you into an uncomfortable space, but uncomfortable to me is when I learn the most, when I'm more open to the experience and getting something out of it that's going to be beneficial for not just myself, but for my role in the organization. So,
and if I can elevate two things that you said that are worthy lifting, I think number one, your brain immediately went into, am I worthy? So I think somehow people relate to advocacy, have to do great things.
Mhm.
And I really would like to remind all of us that great things are happening because we are in this field. So there's nothing special for you to do. You already did the work when you did your master's and got the C's, or whatever you did to come to a place where you took an oath that I will treat a patient with dignity and respect, right? So
Mhm.
that's number one. Number two, I think, so I think, am I worthy? I like to ask, why am I representing the group that I'm representing rather than am I worthy? And I remind myself a lot of work went into coming to this place of advocacy. And then the second thing is, you said the second thing which needs elevating is, wow, this is a lot. And I like to challenge ourselves because majority of our professional colleagues are really concerned about time. And I
Mhm.
think the biggest thing that I like to remind that you have a choice to spend your time. The truth that does not change is there are only 168 hours in a week. That truth doesn't change for you. It doesn't change for me. I like to do this very complicated math, if you can bear with me. So let's assume 600 hours go in sleeping. I'm being very facetious. You could do 60 hours or 100 hours. And then remaining 60 hours, let's assume, or maybe let's say 68 hours we sleep and 100 hours are left. Let's say 40 hours out of that go in direct work. All of us know none of our work is direct 40-hour work. It's always more. So now you have 60 hours. Fine, let's take 20 additional hours that go into our supporting the work that we are doing that pays us, those who work. So now we are looking at 100 hours minus, say, 40 hours plus 20, 60 hours. Now we have 40 hours, and 40 hours humanly possible. Let's put 4 hours, 7 days a week. So now you have 28 hours and now you're looking at 12 hours, let's say. And I like to remind people that you can give 30 minutes of your time.
Mhm. Yeah.
And this 30 minutes is, do not give 5 minutes a week. Give concerted 30-minute chunk, because a lot can happen in 30 minutes. And the other thing is, those who are starting in this profession, and maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but if you are starting I'm born and raised in India, and we have a very beautiful cultural practice, and it's called mama. So when we do certain procedures for a wedding, for example, a husband and wife or mother and father and their daughter are sitting in this, and you can touch the person who is doing the action and say the word mama. So you get the same benefit from that action that somebody who's senior to you is doing. And so I like to say, do mama. That means join an organization that's already doing, has the structure, and has the system. You are just part of it. So instead of starting something from the scratch in your community, and I hope when we talk about some of the work that I have done, join ASHA PAC. Join something in your state that already exists and give your 30 minutes, not even every week, once a month. Now this is called advocacy. So that's doable, so don't be overwhelmed by the magnitude of how much work there is to be done.
Yeah, and when I became the secretary, I was early in my career. I really didn't know what to expect, but it was really not a huge commitment. My role was to attend meetings, which we had I think it was quarterly, if I remember right, and maybe one extra. And we did our board meetings. I took minutes, I edited the minutes, and I sent them out to the group for any feedback or edits they wanted. That was really the whole role. It was really the whole role. That's what I did. And it was a great way to jump in without it being overwhelming. But again, you can be a committee member for your state conference. You can be, and that again doesn't have to be a huge chunk of time. I find a lot of people really like either membership or conference committee, because they get to do the site visit to the potential site for conferences. They get to explore the site once it's chosen, and kind of figure out what lecturer is going to go in what space and where the student posters are going. And it's really good for people who are great at organization and planning, they really tend to love the role, and they're working with, maybe 10 other people. Sometimes it's only 5 other people, but it tends to be one of the larger committees. Same with membership. You're highlighting members who don't have to necessarily be doing something, out of this world, but they're highlighting someone in the membership who either someone nominated, or we did a lottery system when I was the VP of membership. We would do a lottery system of members, and I would reach out to, 3 to 5 people, because usually 2 don't respond and 3 might. And then you can pick who to highlight, or you'll have 3 that respond, and you've got 3 months worth of people that you can highlight, and whatever their skill set is, private practice arenas, practice settings vary, all that kind of stuff. So it's, again, nothing that was really time consuming. It was actually kind of fun, because it was a way to network without the pressure being tied to your day-to-day job and your paycheck. You're reaching outside of your kind of comfort zone and meeting someone in another part of your state that you may not have interacted with before, or ever, if you hadn't have volunteered in that role. So I think that's a really important kind of point to make as well. One thing that I really wanted to ask you, though, was what was your why? What led you to be an advocate? And then we'll kind of jump into some of the work that you've done. But I wanted to ask you, what was that spark that led you to be such an avid advocate?
Well, thank you for that question. And I think becoming an advocate is a journey. I don't see it as a thing happened, but there are many things happened. I think there were some things that was mark of the kind of person I am, or I was. I'm very perceptive. I was labeled as very sensitive, which I kind of objected as a child, because there's almost like you have emotions, and I have changed that language, and I used to kind of deny that I am sensitive. Now I describe myself as a very perceptive person. I recognize emotions in other people. So that was kind of my gateway in, being raised in India, being a only daughter and 2 brothers. There was always a little bit of what the liberties that my brother had that I didn't, and I was very upset about it. And it was my parents' good faith effort to keep me safe. I get it. But also I felt, so I was very perceptive to this notion of inherent superiority versus inherent inferiority. So I would say that was the seed of advocacy in me. So I always kind of recognized if somebody was given a chance for things that was out of their control. So for me, as a girl, I was asked to not participate because whatever, now it's teenage years, so you no longer can just hang like my brother did. He would come home after 9, and that was okay, but I wasn't. So that's that inherent superiority versus inherent inferiority is something I question. The second thing I think that really contributed to my early readiness for advocacy was my strong language and communication skills. I think I really want to highlight that in our profession, being a speech and language pathologist and audiologist, we kind of get a lot of training and become the champions of that set of skills. I speak 5 languages. My parents were very pro language and communication. We absolutely dabbled and immersed in parables, metaphors, rich tapestry of language play in our house. My mother would take a Hindi song and sing it in my mother tongue with the same tune by replacing the words in my mother tongue. And we all learned to do that. We had a lot of cultural games. So I think one thing, for example, also Sanskrit, which is like Latin, you would say, like early on, memorizing verses that were like 200 long verses and taking part in elocution competition. The reason I'm saying that is I think it is really critical, and I'm going to tie that back to why there's such a big responsibility on us as communication experts, because many people may not have access to those linguistic and communication skills. And the third set of skills that I think contributed to advocacy was my ability to stand against obstacles and bullies. So I'll give you an example. When I was a teenager, in high school, there were lots of guys in my class. We had, of course, guys and girls in the same class, and they would stand in the doorway. And so the doorway would become very narrow. And if you wanted to enter the class, you had to squeeze yourself in, creating very uncomfortable situation. So I went straight to the bully, challenged him, and I said, I might slap you. And if I slap you, it's going to be very uncomfortable. He went running to the principal. Of course, the principal called my father. So all this led to like a mayhem. And I said, wait, but the source is him, not me. You know what I mean? So anyway, I think I kind of took on a challenge to, like, I'm not afraid, or I wasn't afraid to challenge everybody. And the last thing I want to kind of really tie into a rich cultural background. My mother was the first girl to go to a school that was started by Indian freedom fighter Dondo Keshav Karve. And he actually fought for the rights of girls to get educated. So my mother grew up in a very tiny village, very oppressed area, very poor area, poverty, poor area. So he came during Indian freedom, fighting movement, and spoke to the villagers to send their girls and to school, and they would refuse. No parents wanted to do that. So after India became free, attained its independence from British, he came back, and then my grandparents they had 5 daughters and 2 sons, and they allowed my mother to go to school. And I think my mother very proudly talked about that opportunity. And so there was somebody advocating for the right of my mother to go to school. And so I think those kinds of heritage things, so maybe talk to your family, what are they advocating for? That could be your story. And so last thing I will say, a particular pinpointing story was when I was in 9th grade, my parents always pushed me to help out. And there was a little girl in the community, and they called her Blue Baby, which is kind of ridiculous. But basically, she had an anoxic injury at birth, and she developed, and now that I look back, probably she had dyslexia and some, written language disorder. Anyway, so I used to tutor her. And only after working with her, I realized how brilliant she was. She was fantastic in math. She had very unclear communication skills. And I started talking about her to her peers, who are, of course, like 3 years younger than me, about how smart and making sure that she gets included. So I would say the spark started there in kind of 9th grade.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think it's really important to have that access to your why. And that, again, I think relating it back to cultural roots, you're, like you mentioned, the strong language-based skills and our ability to communicate so well. A lot of us are really staunch advocates for providing great community education and caregiver education. And that's another way that we really get our foot in the door for advocacy without even really noticing. I think that that's what we're doing. I worked in acute care for a long time, and that was one of the things that was challenging to me, because I had come from inpatient rehab where I felt like our system was set up very well for advocacy and for communication and education with families and caregivers. And I went to acute care where it was a different demographic. We were seeing patients that weren't always so well connected and maybe didn't have insurance. If they even had insurance, they might not have had great insurance. And so their literacy often was something that was challenging for written educational materials, but then also for their background. They weren't always even high school graduates where I worked. They were sometimes actually actively incarcerated and not just having prior convictions. And that's one of the things that I kind of wanted to touch on with you, because I know that you've done a lot with looking at people who have been incarcerated and trying to find that middle ground, or that in for those patients to have that competency to be able to go back and have access to not only healthcare literacy, but in your community, you've done a lot with that. So can you kind of talk about that piece?
Yeah, and I think I have to contribute to that a particular direction in my life 10 years ago when I did Leadership Atlanta. And Leadership Atlanta really opened one of the most interesting facet of that was one of my actually client's father nominated me, and another client's father nominated me for TED Talk. So I think I never considered my work might interest general public, in quotes. We are in, like, I thought GASHA, ASHA, that's it, and I'm done. And I think Leadership Atlanta really opened my connection to my city. I came out of my silo and kind of really got a deep and wide education regarding the what city or collective leaders in the city, in the vicinity metro area, as well as in the state of Georgia, are trying to tackle. And that led to this understanding of educational outcomes for children. Well, like 1.7 million children in Georgia, and their journey through education, role of poverty, housing, even incarceral system, and harsher punishments. So at the same time, one of my very dear friends we have been friends for 25 years, started a nonprofit called Georgia Works. And it's a nonprofit that their mission was to end homelessness, criminal recidivism, dependency through programs aimed at really personal development of good habits, work ethic, and character. And one of the interesting programmatic structure they had was to provide stipend and really take individuals without secure housing, and most of them were coming from prison system, and then provide them with this structure where they actually have to be drug-free, and they have to be housed for 30 days, and they receive a stipend for their stay, but they have to go through drug rehab or become clean, so to speak, and then immediately are placed into employment. And then entire training is worked around their journey of gainfully employed individual whose wages will not allow you to sustain with this crisis that we have, right? Would not allow you to rent a property, will not allow you to actually maybe buy groceries or pay child support or pay your debt that has made you not lose your license. So I went to volunteer. So I've been volunteering with many systems and places that interest me. Battered women's shelter, hospice care. So I just, where people meet in the most difficult places, is very deeply interests me. So I went, and what happened is I sat on many intakes as a person was coming into the Georgia Works program. And I was blown away by the intake process, because having 25 years of expertise in interviewing and assessing communication needs, I thought when they were determining factors that will allow emergence of independence were not fully thought from the communication as a central piece of it. And majority of them were struggling with staying employed during their internship process because, for example, a man showed up at his temporary work, externship with a gun, and he just didn't think much of it. He thought, I just have a gun. And they're like,
Right.
no, it's not cool to have a gun when you're working on this particular thing. Or kind of like getting really mad at a coworker and ramming this little machine that he was using and destroying property, like things like that. So a lot of reasons. Being late was a huge issue, or not really seeing the forest for the trees. So I saw such a grave need for executive function deficit and communication deficits. And they were not deficits from a traditional way, that it was not an impairment. It was genuinely somebody who had been oppressed by systems that never provided adequate opportunities that become, or I hate the term, but called soft skills, that allow you to navigate, advocate. But the biggest need I noticed was their ability to communicate what the need is and protect the rightfully opportunities that were given to them that were lost in a minute because of a mishap or executive dysfunction. So anyway, so that was the beginning of it. At that time, I just was also president-elect. So as the president-elect, I wanted to launch initiatives in Georgia. And one of the things that I learned from my programming, that I need to kind of create something that brings the volunteers together. We celebrate them, but then also take volunteers who are communication experts into places that they would never step. So one of the things that I really thought a lot about, that our services are so expensive. And if you're not in school, then it's a healthcare benefit. And if you have no impairment, then there's no healthcare benefit that includes serviced by audiologist or speech pathologist, right? And
Right.
so it's really like, and then most of the folks that worked with these individuals were social worker, and their focus was very different than what our focus was. So anyway, so what I created something. So first I did, those who are interested in this process, I started with something called initial exploratory process. So my executive committee and we went to the center. We actually did preliminary research, which revealed that there were some gaps in their skill set, which is comprehending and meeting work expectations, articulating and advocating for work and personal needs more effectively, or also, forming meaningful interpersonal and social relationships at work, but not crossing the boundary, like seeing who first female coworker and asking her out. Like there were 5 men who got placed and there was one manager and they're like all asking her out, which was not proper. And so even that kind of decorum. And then managing everyday emotions, including anger, frustration, and stress, and working towards balanced mental health needs and economic independence. So that was the preliminary research. So I brought that to the table, formulated a plan, created a protocol. So it was a very involved process. Number one, and that's why you need very strong executive function skills, because one, you have to create a structure for volunteers to connect to the cause. So I had to create a website, I had to create forms, Google Forms, I had to create instructional one-pagers for the volunteers, like the way to dress, where to park, like this was in the inner city, how to make sure that you are safe, but also how to not get freaked out just because you see minority majority community, like people who have never entered those places. How to understand the distinction between like the building where this center was a mecca for a displaced community. And so they would all come out to smoke. And it would be very scary if you don't know they're out because they are smoking. It may look simply like, oh my God, would they rob me? Like if you bring your cultural context, that's all you would think. So anyway, so that was first strand. The second strand was the work. Like, what are we going to do? Because this was not a therapeutic approach. This was it was a culturally sensitive communication program that benefits at the intersection of their need. So I kind of formed a task force and then invited, and this was, by the way, my favorite part, which is I got to hang out with my favorite people that are my colleagues in neurogenic communication disorders who work with adults. So we got together and we kind of formulated created a task force. And as a result of a task force, we created a form. What kind of questions to ask? How to, we don't get hours and hours and there's no formal assessment battery you're giving, right? So we kind of created a very sensitive questions that tap into their need. We also brought in the element of video recording, creating assignment, and then this was all done in group setting. So I'm happy to I think I sent you a link so you can look at the video and feel free to share that with everybody. But I want to talk about some other ways to bring in other partnerships in the community. But when the program started, so then we went to the program director. So this was not my friend who founded the whole thing. There was the executive director of this nonprofit, Georgia Works. And then we kind of met with them and tried to understand because they were paying men to work, they couldn't really have them free to attend our communication class. And we also noticed that the communication class cannot be 1 hour. It has to be 2 hours, and we had to do some individual work and then we had to do some group work. So we designed activities, we designed a curriculum. We actually recommended that they have to do 10 sessions when they graduated, because at that time I also co-founded George Gasha Foundation. And one of the things I brought to the foundation that we should give stipends to men who graduate from this communication program with great effort and with great commitment to their self-work. And so we were able to triage. And then the third prong was to actually involve SLPs and audiologists. What was so fascinating that we had students participate, we had people who work with children. They have never worked with adults came. We had people who actually don't do neurogenic communication disorders. They work with adults, but they don't do that kind of thing. And it was very interesting. We did orientation for them. We had Zoom orientation. So a lot of things I learned from this programming. I ran that program for close to 8 or 9 years. The later part, what we did, one of the interesting structures they had, that people who graduated from this program then joined and became staff. And then they had their own leadership journey. However, they themselves were clients once. So some of them had residual challenges that kept coming and interfering with their ability to stay sober, save money, not get in any legal trouble, or even find advocacy to get their license freed and form partnerships. Majority of this program exclusively served men, so it was not that we were excluding women. The program was for men. But what we found that there was so much eagerness to return back to their families without really priming the family. And so many things had changed. If you were incarcerated for 17 years, and if your family had not seen, and you want to now walk into their lives, you had to. So it was interesting from programmatic perspective how to design a program by understanding the need of the community. And we learned a lot from that. Happy to share the video if you want to see that video now also. But it was just an interesting, magnificent, fascinating, very rewarding process to launch that project.
Yeah, I'm actually going to put I'll have Speech Therapy PD put the show notes up that has the links to the videos, because I think I graduated from the leadership development program last year for healthcare from ASHA. Well, earlier this year, it seems like a year ago, because we start a year before we graduate. But a lot of people don't understand or didn't realize that you actually have to design a project that is measurable. You have to have things embedded in there of why you would do it, but also how are you going to measure this project's progress and the viability for whatever the organization is. And so for me, I did it for our state organization, and we're still implementing it now. But it is interesting, even when you have had, like, I had the leadership background and then a lot of people do the leadership development program and then do the leadership portion, and I did it in reverse, because when I applied for the LDP the first time, it was right when the pandemic started, right when I was getting ready to be president. So I was sort of wanting to do it in conjunction, and that's just not how it happened. But what I learned was, because I had that role prior to, I felt like I was able to work out some of those barriers and those kinks, if you will, that I probably wouldn't have been mindful of before going to develop a program for the state organization. Because I think a lot of times we have these great and big ideas, and they are great and big ideas, but the launching, the little hiccups along the way, those details, those things that if you haven't experienced it, you may not be mindful of how to navigate that. So I think, you having mentioned this program was specifically for men, and those little pieces along the way is really helpful. And yes, I saw that KK asked. Yes, I'm going to send that over. So it may not be posted tonight, but hopefully, well, it's Christmas Eve tomorrow, but we'll get it. we'll get it on the website.
I put the video page link. But I wanted to say one thing about the program elements that were very, very effective. And please consider doing something like this in your communities. I think number one is we did role playing. That was really remarkable. We asked people to submit situations. So, for example, the men lived in a dorm, and if there was any mishap, and they had the RAs, the resident advisors, who would be there, and we gathered, and they would write a ticket for infraction. And when the infraction would happen, in quotes, they would lose their right to go out for a smoke break. They, and all these infractions are literally prospective memory failure, your inability to remind yourself to remember, or losing your temper and kind of blowing off any kind of self-regulatory control, not being situationally aware. And what we did is we actually took all the scenarios and took situations and converted them into scenarios for them to practice. And I used for 20 years, I have developed brain injury rehab training programs for adults. And one of the programs when I was at Mass General was called Steps to Success. And it was one of the things that we did in the training programs there, but they were people with brain injuries, with attention, memory, and executive dysfunction, that they would have to turn in homework. They would have to do self-reflection, and they would get lessons in brain operation, the way your brain works. So a question I would often ask, are you in charge of your brain, or is your brain in charge of you? And I think even this shift that your brain should not be in charge of you, you are in charge of your brain. So that means you can do better because you're in charge of your brain. And just educating them regarding how the prefrontal cortex works, or even the structure of how memory happens, or types of attention. Providing them that information, people found so much empowerment in using the language to describe their difficulties. They kind of started saying, instead of, if they were late, first they would never apologize. And I wouldn't generalize, but they would not consider apologies necessary. That was yesterday. I was late. Well, you are 3 times late, and now this is the last time. Now speak on behalf of yourself, right? So kind of explaining to their bosses that I'm so sorry I'm late. The reason I'm late is I put an alarm, but the phone was dead and the alarm never went off. This even explanation. And I don't know, I tied a lot of science for social psychology and even cognitive neuroscience. So for example, I don't know if you remember, if you are familiar with, listeners, a very simple study was done several years ago, 20 years ago. And this is, you'll know how old the study is, because this was college students. And of course, this is all about college students. They were asked to photocopy. And the confederate of the participant, the confederate of the experiment was the one who interrupts. So the participant in the study was asked to photocopy, but the confederate comes and say, can I please photocopy? And they did several conditions. So number 1, can I photocopy? And then they saw who allows you to photocopy. Second, you says, can I photocopy? Because I need to photocopy. And then the third condition was, can I photocopy? Because I'm running late and this project is very important, otherwise I'm going to get an F. And what they found, that there was such a remarkable difference between who allowed an interruption and anybody who says, people, the group that said, can I photocopy because I need a photocopy, also were allowed to photocopy. So when we talk about advocacy, explaining your motivation and intention to other, or speaking on behalf of your reason or rationale, can really do a selling job. And even sharing this research with the participants, they felt very, very validated, that they were treated like respectful men, as intelligent adult ed. We've always situated our classes as adult ed, and they were given brain science, latest trends in brain science, which was very, very valued by them. And their language changed, their ability to explain themselves changed. And then also they kind of saw why people were not responding when they did. So those are the kinds of changes that we are really hard to describe, right? These are not the things that we typically are measuring, because we are looking for very radical change, but subtle change is what we saw.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me because one of the, I'm on the East Coast of Virginia, and so our community is very much a lot of military. My family, my dad was a worker at the local shipyard, which is a huge shipyard, but there's a lot of ports here. There's a lot of military here. There's a lot of transient people. There's a lot of culture that's different from some more rural areas in our state. And one of the things that I always was fascinated with, even before I became an SLP, was the difference between kids that I went to school with who came from a really disparate background. We're not really set up for success as children or young adults, but somehow made a way to make such a great effort into their own education or their own ability to hold a job or a career to make a difference in their community, versus the people that kind of got stuck in that same pattern of generational trauma and weren't able to ever break out. And it's always been just fascinating to me to see that, because I think it does speak a lot to exposure to what you're, like you mentioned, you being in charge of your brain, you being aware of your executive functions and how to make better choices, stop and think before you act, don't just react, you being proactive. And those are not things that everyone is taught, right? We don't really inherently just know that. It's exposure and having someone who, whether that starts in your elementary school or your high school or your college experience, or if you didn't have a college experience, your trade experience, there's someone along the way who has shown you that or taught you that makes a difference. Would you agree with that?
100%. I think I think once again, my pet peeve is that we call these soft skills. My
Mhm.
pet peeve is we are, I used to tell people what I do is I work with smart underachievers. So executive dysfunction actually points out the gap between your potential and your ability to actualize the potential. And when
Mhm.
you have disenfranchised life experiences, fundamentally poverty, then your interrupted educational experience, then criminal justice system that may be even against you, and then a hard knock experiences that have really created incredible suffering. So many of our patients, like so many participants, we served more than 100 individuals. They had history of learning disability. They had history of hearing loss. They had multiple history of multiple concussions. They had concussions after going to work, and many 80% of them had suffered from some sort of drug addiction. And so I
Mhm.
think, I mean, this also, of course, my worldview has changed about drug addiction. I used to world view, and my conventional wisdom way is that you have a drug addiction problem. And now that I'm more educated, you're using the drug addiction is kind of needs to unveil the problems that may be trauma. There may
Mhm.
have tendency for drug addictive behaviors or a response to life's glitter with addiction, but there were no systems that created guardrails for you to not or say no. And lastly, I would say, I think the one particularly just being in the field for 25, 30 years, we have changed. Culture has changed, and what was considered unacceptable has become acceptable. And now it's our responsibility that what is acceptable needs to be finessed. So it's acceptable to have criminal record because now we are recognizing maybe there are systemic injustices. But my work in executive functions domain has taught me there's something called multifaceted goal attainment. That means I'm a father, I'm also a worker, I'm also a resident of Georgia Works. How do I attain goals in all domains of my life that gives me this sense of multifacetedness? And I think when OTM, one track mind, if you're achieving goals in one domain, you're succeeding. The minute you make your life mission to achieve more than one domain of your life, you start teetering. And that's what I was seeing again and again with these individuals, that if they focused on one thing, they potentially could achieve something. But who is living a unidimensional life? We all are multifaceted. So I think we have become more compassionate. We need to, lastly, I want to quickly touch upon my work as a board member of Ending Mass Incarceration, a faith initiative that, Senator Warnock started here in Georgia. And it is now, has a presence in 6 other major cities, including Dallas, Chicago, New York. And I have been able to participate. In fact, I'm getting ready to post something on my social that this summer I went to Dallas, and this one nonprofit brought prison cells. I hope people know the difference between jail versus prison, and the prison material, what kind of material, and Dallas heat. And we were given an opportunity to stand there for a minute or 2 minutes. I could not withstand that more than a minute.
Oh, wow.
I felt I was about to die, and I came out. And so there are people who are talking about there is intentionally, we are not even providing air or electricity or fan because it's considered giving too much leeway into somebody who has been incarcerated. So I think if we can think about a humanitarian approach to the work that we are doing in our communities, I think every person needs our participation, and every community member that is suffering and struggling needs a strong advocate with great communication like us to join the forces to reduce their suffering if we can't eliminate it.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And the one other thing that I really wanted to touch on that I was kind of fascinated by was the connection to art through some of the initiatives with Gisha that you did, in particular the scope of practice videos, because I found that fascinating. And again, we'll put this up on the Speech Therapy PD website for the show notes. But if we could kind of just close out by you talking about that, because I think it's
I
fascinating.
think I want to tell that as a fun story because
Yes.
I want you all to understand that we do such hard work. And we need to create communities where we come together and find inspiration to do the hard work. So as president of GASHA, I created 3 initiatives. And what I wanted to do is to really celebrate. So when I gave my TED Talk, the person who went after me was this artist called Everman. And I don't know if you have heard of him, but he's this incredible artist who creates art with people. And he has a little emblem, and I think I have included that in the show notes if you can put a link to it. And it's a little wood. He makes a square. Oh, give me 1 second. I'm going to grab it.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. So thank you for sticking with us.
Thank you, guys. So this is those who are on a video chat, I mean, on video can see this. So this was his art piece, and it's kind of like a stamp. And then we did GASHA Gives. We made our own stamp. And then what you do is you go around the city and hide it. And anybody who finds it gets to keep it. And it was such a wonderful, so we met as a group. We got wine and cheese and chocolate. We met in his studio, in his woodwork shop, and we actually cut pieces. We stamped them, we painted them. So that was one of the pieces of offering something to the community for being a speech pathologist and audiologist and doing this hard work. So not only we were doing GASHA Gives, which is a real grunt work, very difficult, heart-wrenching work, and sometimes you walked away by saying, oh my God, how is this going to matter? Like this, we're making such a little difference. So that was the piece that I wanted to talk about. And I think you mentioned the third piece, right? And I think the third was as a PR chair. So before I became the president, my first job at GASHA, when Kelly Ball asked me to join, was convention. I worked on a convention committee as a volunteer, and then I moved to PR. PR always interested me. And
Yeah,
so
I did PR too.
yeah, did you see? And I just love so one gap that I noticed that our profession is so complicated and fantastic. And yet I once wrote an article called I Wish I Was a Plumber. And that and I said, whenever I go on a plane and person sits next to you and say, what do you do for a living? And I'm like, oh my God, there it goes. I have to explain. It takes like 2 or 3 minutes. But if somebody says I'm a plumber, like conversation stops. I know exactly what you do, right? Anyways, so what I did is there was a local partnership. So one of my clients was actually friends with this director at it's the Art Institute of Atlanta. And so I met with this gentleman who had students. So he had 40 students who were enrolled in film, photography, videography, and they needed a project. So I took my project to them and said, would you help us create videos of a scope of practice? So the scope of practice videos is interviewing experts from all walks of life and created a public service tool. So if people are wanting to know what does a speech pathologist do? Well, we treat stuttering, we treat voice, we also do artic, we do language development, we do reading disorders, right? So I had experts from all walks of life. These were all volunteers. We got them. They got hair and makeup. Everybody showed up, and the students did the videos. And then the videos then we published on our website, and then we advocated and talked to our community about what the work is. And still this day, these videos are available, and it's really a wonderful way to bring the community together. So I highly encourage to form partnerships in your community. The partnership, as I said, Everman, the artist, the Art Institute with Joe was the director of the Art Institute. And then Bill McGann was the founder of Georgia Works. And then I worked with the whole team of Georgia Works. So tap into your community and ask them if they would need your services. I'm in the process, as I end, working on forming some partnerships with a domestic violence group, nonprofit, because I really want to take the latest research. Somebody like Lynn Turkstra is working, a small amount of effort has gone into impact on or brain injury as a result of domestic violence. And so I want to create some programming for women who are in the battle shelters so that they can have access to some tools and strategies to manage their fogginess or manage their attention or executive function impairment.
Yeah, that's fantastic and greatly needed. And it's, again, it's so fascinating, the full circle things that come about at the podcast, because one of the clinician videos that I watched as an undergraduate student was, and this was a long time ago, but it was a domestic violence survivor who had a pretty serious, significant TBI as a result of that, and having her go through therapy at our speech clinic because that was the only access to care she had at that point. And she was a mother and someone who had had a career prior to. So I think it's fascinating how long it's taken, but at the same time, still so needed. So I'm excited to see how that plays out. Because interestingly enough, I used McKay Solberg and Lynn's book for my TBI class this past fall for my graduate students. So yeah, it's interesting. We all are connected in some way, shape, or form. Yeah.
Realize I'm mute. If people have any parting questions before we wrap this up, I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, and I'll kind of start to close out while we wait and see if anyone has questions. But Sucheta, you know that I just appreciate you so much for sharing with us this evening. It means a lot. And I definitely will put the show note or get the show notes put up, because there's a lot more information that you will have access to that goes above and beyond what we've talked about tonight, because we could have probably done 2 hours on this topic for both of us. So I really appreciate you coming on. And again, thank you for your continued work and the work that you've already done. And thank you for being so willing to share it with us.
I really thank you. And for the audience, I can't believe you guys are here on 23rd of December. You're my kind of people. And I'm so grateful for your presence in my life, because I find inspiration from all of you. I think our children, our adults are so much better, and our families, because of the hard work you are doing. So my immense gratitude.
Thank you again. And I hope you have a wonderful holiday. We'll be in touch.
Thank you so much. Have a great one, guys.
Yeah, you too. Thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to seeing you again.
If you have indicated that you are part of the ASHA registry and entered both your ASHA number and a complete address in your account profile prior to the course completion, we will submit earned CEUs to ASHA. Please allow 1 to 2 months from the completion date for your CEUs to be reflected on your ASHA transcript. Each episode comes with an accompanying course on speechtherapypd.com, available for a 0.1 ASHA CEU. And just for our listeners, get $20 off any subscription with promo code BRAINSTORMS20. SpeechTherapyPD.com is run by SLPs for SLPs. We've got the largest library of ASHA CEU eligible courses out there, adding fresh content every week. Remember, use Brainstorms20 to get $20 off access to over 1,000 courses for an entire year. Head over to SpeechTherapyPD.com for more information and start earning CEs today. Thanks for tuning in to Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs. And don't forget, SpeechTherapyPD.com is your go-to for all things ASHA CEUs. Your positive reviews and support mean the world to us. We'd love for you to drop us a quick review and hit that follow button.